Thank you so much. It's great to hear the organ in live context before we move into our content tonight. So the next portion of our event, we will hear from filmmaker Will Fraser about his experiences documenting the cultural heritage around the pipe organ. Will Fraser was born in England, but spent much of his early life in Nova Scotia. Trained as a writer, filmmaker, and organist, he has written, produced, and directed documentaries about music for more than 20 years. In 2007, he founded Fugue State Films for the purpose of creating a unique set of films that explores the rich history and culture of the pipe organ, and which, when completed, will form an encyclopedia of the pipe organ and its music. He has won awards for the classical music documentaries he makes through Fugue State Films, including BBC Music Magazine's Best DVD twice, and the Deutschen Schallplattenkritikpreis 3 times. Will's body of work includes the films Martini Kirk Rondo, The Genius of Cavaillé Cole, Maximum Reger, The English Organ, Bach and Expression, Bach's Missing Pages, and most recently, Bach the Great Toccata, among several other films. Will has told me he is fascinated by America, and as such, he has made 3 films about our country so far. They are Soul Searching for the Blues, Once Upon a Time in Knoxville, and Cowboy and Preacher, which explores the disjunct and possible points of connection between evangelical Christianity and environmentalism. This film, Cowboy and Preacher, premiered in Hollywood at the 2018 Dances with Films Festival, and it will be broadcast on PBS World on April 22nd. Is that right? Earth Day, in honor of Earth Day. So you can catch that on a local station near you. We're very pleased to have Will here with us from London to share some excerpts and reflections on his work. And now I'd like to ask you to help me welcome him to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. It's very, very lovely to be here. This is not my normal life, coming to give talks and stuff, so I'm very appreciative. Obviously, I would really like to take a moment to thank Annie Laver, who has made this all possible. She's absolutely brilliant. I think we all know that, and it's lovely to come here to work with her, both for this festival, but also hopefully for our own film, which we're starting to kind of get off the ground at the moment. Annie has asked me to sort of show a few clips which I guess give the story of my career as a filmmaker, which I'm very happy to do. I always sort of feel a bit almost a bit embarrassed, like, my God, not another film about the organ. But the organ is, I think, a very, very fascinating and interesting subject, a truly absorbing thing. I think if you're interested in the organ, you'll never be bored. And so hopefully you won't be bored with these succession of 7 short clips. Where I'd like to start is actually my first film, which I finished in 2001, and I graduated from university in 1998, and then I moved to Canada, and I wanted to make films, and I was very sort of excited. I had all sorts of ideas, but the challenge I faced was at that point, films were made, there was basically no internet in the way that we know of it today, and films had to be done for broadcast and for a general audience. And so I remember talking to people, there are all sorts of ideas about films. I lived in Canada at that point, and they're very into Canadian content. And so I thought, well, what about a film about the Livre d'Orgue de Montreal, this manuscript which found its way to Montreal in the 18th century? No one would ever be interested in that. So I had to make a film for broadcast, and my first film turned out to be about blues music, which is a sort of enthusiasm of mine. And so this first clip is from a film called Soul Searching for the Blues, which came out on TV in Canada in 2001.
Dave's CC Club is really kind of a throwback to clubs that you didn't think existed anymore. It's in the woods, 20 miles outside of Tallahassee, Florida, right on the Georgia border. it's the only place like it that I've ever played. I mean, you go down a dirt road, there's no address. Like when you send something to Dave's, you just send it to the street.
So you can see that in some respects we've moved on a bit since that kind of film. It was shot in 4:3. That film predates 16:9, which is the current aspect ratio that's used most often. There were one or two other things which were challenging about making a film for broadcast. It took a long time to make the film. It took 2.5 years to make it because you had to deliver things. You had to deliver your script, then you had to develop it, then you had to deliver the film, then you had to deliver such and such a cut, and you'd get drawdowns of money, which meant that you then had to have interim financing in place with a bank, which then meant you had legal fees, blah, blah, blah. It's all very complex. But what happened in the years immediately afterwards was that there's basically a revolution, and films became very cheap to make because equipment became much better in quality and went down in price. So suddenly anyone could make a film. And then the internet, which was kind of gathering pace through this whole sort of period, allowed you to find the people who you wanted to make the film about. This is completely self-evident to us now, but 20 years ago it was not self-evident. And I went to a talk in London where someone laid out how you can make films for your niche audience, and I suddenly realized, yes, now is the moment I can start making films about what I want to make films about, which was the history of the pipe organ. So we set about doing this. I created Fugue State Films, and one of our first films was about Cavaillé Coll, the famous French organ builder. And just to, the next clip is the first couple of minutes of that film. But just to introduce, how do you actually make a film about the organ? Because the organ, there's, really we should be asking that question to the thousands of people who put up films of themselves on YouTube. How do you make a film about the organ? It's not always easy, it would seem. And I think the thing to do is to lavish the subject matter with all the care and attention you can. In terms of locations, going to the right locations, spending time there. Cavaillé Coll had a 40-day shoot, which even for a feature film is kind of, that's 8 weeks of filming. To make sure you have the best interviewees, the best organists you can get your hands on. And then you need to structure it into a story. And I think often the way story structure works is that people are overcoming obstacles. And so with Cavaillé Coll himself overcame great obstacles in his career. And that, if you start thinking about like the subject matter like that, then you can create a compelling narrative, because the whole point of making a film is that you want to make a film that people want to watch. And it's got to engage on a story level as well as a musical level. So here's the opening of The Genius of Cavaillé Coll.
19th century in France, some of the most popular organ music ever written was created by composers such as Franck, Saint-Saëns and Widor. But this magnificent music would never have come about were it not for the man who built the organs that inspired it. And he was Aristide Cavaillé-Coll, a revolutionary organ builder who built instruments that were quite different from anything that had been seen before, and this at a time when organ music was not popular.
When Cavaillé-Coll was born in 1811, the French organ and organ music was in quite a stagnant position, as it had been since the Revolution. When Cavaillé-Coll finished his career, organ music and the organ had been completely renewed. There was an enormous and very prestigious repertoire, and even the music of Bach had been rediscovered, largely thanks to the instruments that Cavaillé-Coll provided.
Cavaillé-Coll was an artist in the broadest sense of the word, both a true creator and a trendsetter, and also an ambitious industrialist. He built or rebuilt nearly 500 organs, and all of them to a uniformly excellent standard.
If it were necessary to define Cavaillé-Coll's specific genius, I suppose it would be the same congruent genius as in other musical and other creators. It's an expression of form through the content. Transcendental is a word that comes to mind. I think that it is very difficult in that respect to analyze Cavaillé-Coll beyond the physical object of his organs, and yet there is something in the soul of his sound, the conception, the coherence of his instruments that is simply beauty. And it is, as some have written or said, music personified in the organ.
Although not a musician himself, Cavaillé-Coll was very well aware of how important it was that music was played on his instruments, and he personally intervened in the careers of organists and composers to ensure that music was written and performed on his instruments.
Cavaillé-Coll worked closely together with the organists of his time. Of course, he listened to them, he took their advice, but when you look at the actual chronology, you would realize that Cavaillé-Coll was there before them. For instance, César Franck, who was one of the greatest names, perhaps the greatest name involved in the creation of these pieces, he was 11 years Cavaillé-Coll's junior. Cavaillé-Coll then provided the musical material for the composers to use, and it might be asked how many organ builders can claim to have inspired such a magnificent repertoire.
In this film, we will explain who Cavaillé-Coll was, how he came to create such magnificent instruments, and how he gave rise to a whole new school of organ composition.
Obviously, the genius of Cavaillé-Coll is about an organ builder, and one of the things we're trying to do is not just celebrate music and organists, but also organ building, which is a kind of fascinating livelihood. Can I just point out that American organ building is leading the world? I believe that there are more organ builders in America, and it employs more people than I think the rest of the world put together or something like that. So at least I think there are something like 40 people employed in organ building full-time in the UK or something ridiculously small like that. Anyway, the next film is a little shot of a little sequence of someone making an organ pipe. This is in Jürgen Ahren's workshop in Ostfriesland, in the very west of North Germany. And it was quite funny because the organ builder, the pipe maker, he was very annoyed with us because we kept having to make him stop. He could have made the pipe in 30 seconds or something, but he kept having to stop while we said, no, you've got to do that again. Can you do that? But anyway, this is, I think, a fun clip that you might enjoy. One of the things, if you watch credit sequences of films, you see enormous numbers of names. The genius of Cavaillé, there were 3 of us who did everything. With this film, Martini Kirk Rondo, there are actually only 2 of us. The audio was, all the organs were recorded by a local doctor who would just turn up the night before and put up a mast and vanish. And so it's a very, very light touch that we bring to filmmaking, and luckily that's kind of all you need. But this was also back in the day when we only had 1 camera. Now it's normal to take 3 or 4 cameras, or 17 cameras we had for the performance of our recent Messiaen film, where every conceivable angle around the organ was covered. And so when you see this next clip of Sietze de Vries playing a pedal solo from the Martini Kirk, all the inserts, we had to sort of do those afterwards. We couldn't just film it all at once. One thing which I greatly enjoy engaging with is improvisation in musicians. I've been lucky to work with some organists who are very good at improvisation, and it's always nice. And I think from the perspective of the organist, there's only so much repertoire, and if you can improvise, it brings something unique to whether it's the concert or the film, and I think the audience will appreciate that. So this is an improvised pedal solo at the Martini Kirk in Groningen with Sietze de Vries playing. Martini Kirk is completely independent. There's no grate to pedal or anything like that, or whatever they'd call it, the Hoofdwerk to pedal or whatever. I try and make films very simply. You can see, you've seen a few clips now. There's no great razzmatazz going on. That's for 2 reasons. One, it's kind of how I like to make films, but also because I don't have much choice. We don't really have the resources generally to do much more than that. But nonetheless, there are moments when you think, if we're making a film, we want to try and actually express the art of film too, and do something interesting. When I had to do the credit sequence for the English organ, we kind of had to do something while the credits were rolling away. And I had this idea that I've never seen anyone else do, and so as a sort of experiment, and hopefully it takes film off in a new direction, that if I lined up all the shots that we'd got basically in every location from everywhere we'd been, that's I think 33 locations, and shaved each one down to be 7 frames long, so that's 3 and a bit per second, you would get this kind of journey through English history in the duration of the credit sequence. So that's what we did. I was very lucky to work with Daniel Molt, who's one of my favorite organists, and I said, I want you to improvise the credit music. We're going to do it on the Royal College of Organists' mad little 14th, 15th century organ, which is hand pumped. So it's going to be in mean tone at who knows what pitch. It's about a 4th sharp. And you've got to do it in the style of a 1970s documentary. And so this is the credit sequence which we arrived at. So the film starts normally and then goes a bit wild and then comes back.
What is Englishness? Ancient buildings surrounded by beautiful landscapes tended by human hand? I'm here in Wales, in Old Radnor, but it's here that our journey begins to discover Englishness in the history of the organ. This is the oldest surviving English organ case. There's very little that we know about it. It might have been built in the middle of the 16th century. It's beautifully executed and beautifully proportioned with a golden rectangle for its main bulk. And there's a surprise. When we open the doors here, inside is an 1872 Walker organ. So this really is a case of enigmas. And as such, that typifies much of the English organ and its culture. England is full of historic monuments. So it may come as a surprise that our oldest surviving complete playable church organ dates from 1704, pretty recently compared with your average Iron Age hill fort. There is very little surviving historic organ fabric for reasons we'll discover. In contrast, an amazing number of instruments survive, even if altered, from the 19th and 20th centuries. To tell the story of the English organ, then, we have to look around and beyond the physical evidence, or lack of it. In doing so, we shall forge a compelling narrative about the development of a musical instrument, while also looking at English history from a fresh perspective. As we shall see, the tumults of English history, Reformation, Civil War, revolutions, wars, democratic and demographic change all left their mark on the pipe organs built in this country, and all changed the meaning of the word English.
Of the stories that we tell are actually quite familiar. So the English organ basically tells a story of English history, but it comes from this mad perspective, which is the kind of pipe organ's eye view of things. And I think this, I hope, gives a lot of the films a kind of quirky perspective. Yes, we might know the story, but we'd never quite thought of it like that. So the English organ sees English history from this perspective. And in the 19th century, one of the things that was happening in England was industrialization. We created this great things which we exported everywhere, and we also exported organs. The organ of Sydney Town Hall is basically, at that point, was the biggest organ that anyone had ever built, and was the biggest English organ, and in many respects is kind of the best English organ. One of the great tragedies of English organ building, one of the many tragedies to beset English culture, is that our greatest organ isn't in England and no one knows about it because it's in Sydney. So imagine if you were Dutch and the organ in Haarlem wasn't in Haarlem but was in the Antarctic or something like that. So we're cut off from our culture, and that has affected English organ building because no one knows what the high point of English organ building was, and no one's listened to it because it's on the other side of the world. And so then we have all these dead-sounding, dull organs as a result. Anyway, that's a bit of a sidebar. But nonetheless, the history of the organ is a kind of technological thing as well as a craft and musical story too. And the Sydney Town Hall organ is the size of, I mean, I don't know whether it would fit into this building. It's about, it's huge. It's about the size of a multi-story building. It has staircases, everything like that. It also has a 64-foot pedal reed, which is almost unique, I think. And so these stories, I think, allow us to see these just extraordinary artifacts which are dotted around the world from where people who are either mad or just geniuses leave them. And so here's another clip of the English organ.
Rob, what for you are the three most salient features of this instrument?
I could say 30, but I'll cut off the 0. So 3, look, one has to be the magnificent chorus on the great diapason chorus from 16 foot up to 3 mixtures. I love playing Bach here. Audiences love hearing it. Now, little organs try to sound loud. Big organs do sound loud, so they have the luxury of lots of beautiful quiet stops. And this organ really is gorgeous with its quiet stops. And if I had to just say one more, I would say the organ case. Now, when I look at that case, it is so magnificent, so beautifully designed, so rich in detail, and yet it's just so classical that you look at it and you say, this is a magnificent case. Behind it, there must be a magnificent organ.
And there certainly is, isn't there? Yeah. The detailed and well-made case is an exception at the time. Willis didn't set any store by what an organ looks like, and his cases, such as at Truro, are just pipe racks. Lewis, although a trained architect who collaborated several times with Pearson, often didn't do anything much more elaborate. The Grove organ is resolutely ugly, but that is a conscious part of its design statement. At Sydney, what is behind the case is even more extraordinary, amounting to a multi-storey building complete with staircases and filled with almost 9,000 pipes. Again, just looking up and round. The Barker machines, humidifying plants. Okay, we're going to cut down here, looking up as I go. Back down here, and then back up the staircase here. Wow. And some more pneumatics. Swell box. So these are the tubers. Now, this is the end. Some people describe this instrument as one of the world's greats. Obviously, you're going to agree with that.
Yes.
It sounds different, doesn't it, from so many later 19th century English organs in England. Do you have a theory as to why that might be?
I do indeed. I believe that this organ was so far away from all of the experts in London that Thomas Hill probably built the organ he always wanted to build. And that is an organ with a really classical heart, to which he added then romantic stops. It really has no stops that you would call symphonic on it. So it's a very conservative romantic organ, one that is wonderful for the music from Bach to Mendelssohn. And I believe, it's in my opinion anyway, that when you hear this organ, it doesn't sound like any other organ in the world. It does have its own voice.
always dealing with technical challenges. Wherever we go, things go wrong. And one of the things that went wrong when we were at Sydney Town Hall was we recorded music during the night, and we filmed a concert during the day, but one of the cameras malfunctioned during the day. And so the shot of the audience, we had to grade to the color of the shot to tie those two things together so that the audience looked like they were at the same sort of event that Dan was actually playing at. And so, but that's an example of, there's an element of magic that you can do with film too. A documentary is not exactly real. A documentary is an aestheticized thing in itself, basically. Now, the last clip I'll show you is from one of our very recent films. It's about the Bach Toccata and Fugue in D minor. When I was young, a sort of youth, I had a little piano reduction or arrangement, and I used to sort of plow through it. But since then, I haven't really wanted ever to play that piece ever again. It's sort of very sort of kind of hackneyed, and you hear it all the time, and surely there's all sorts of other pieces that the organ does very well. But nonetheless, it's very well known, and so making a film about it would seem like a good idea, because surely people will want to watch that. So I think if you make films about a subject which you want to engage with people, you have to strike a balance between stuff that they want to hear and stuff that you want to hear. Luckily, the Toccata and Fugue in D minor is not like any of Bach's other organ works. It just is completely sort of on its own, but it is very like a lot of his extremely obscure early harpsichord music. You can see the descending theme and all sorts of things echoed in early fantasias, and also it has all sorts of things in common with the wonderful set of 7 harpsichord toccatas that Bach wrote when he was young. So I think a story, I'm always looking for a way to combine the I suppose something that people will want to watch with the sort of esoteric things that I'm interested in. And so to do that, I also think you have to bring a certain amount of wit. You have to try and make these films witty and engaging. And so this clip is the beginning of our Bach Toccata film, and I hope it shows you that it's possible to take a subject which we all know and love, and yet can be occasionally a bit dry, and make it presented in such a way that people who don't know anything about organ music would actually be interested and want to find out more. Here's the last clip.
Well, just with that opening mordant alone, we've guessed that it's the Bach Toccata and Fugue in D minor. Bach's Great Toccata and Fugue, BWV 565, is one of the world's most celebrated pieces of music. Loved for its power, directness and raw energy, this piece has captured the public imagination like few others. It has dazzled audiences for generations and remains one of the highlights of the instrument's repertoire. But was it by Bach? Was it originally in D minor? Was it even for the organ? It's not strictly a toccata and fugue either, so it really is a piece of enigmas. As an organist, one thing I love about my work is that every pipe organ is different. So is the music. The organ has a huge repertoire, and there are pieces to play from hundreds of years ago to right now. Even among all this music, one composer stands out: Bach, who wrote more organ music than anyone else. Even among Bach's many pieces, one work dominates, that is 565. One of the strengths of 565 is that it can be adapted for a seemingly endless variety of instruments and occasions.
Good. So, in summation, I guess, what we're trying to do is make films about all the interesting schools and periods of the organ and its music, every geographical and chronological period that's of interest. And I'm pleased to say America is next. That's our plan for the next film. Thank you very much.